watch case was empty. That is when I knew my late husband's watch was gone. 30 years of his discipline vanished in one sale. My son sold it to impress his wife. A trip was booked. Cash was taken. No one asked me. The next morning, my phone rang. The jeweler said he had my husband's watch, said there was something engraved inside I was never meant to see. My name is Janet. I am 60 years old. I am a Black American woman. I have learned that truth does not announce itself loudly. It arrives through paperwork, silence, and careful phone calls. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. And drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. I was standing in my husband's study when the call came. The room preserved exactly as he left it. Shelves aligned, papers stacked. The faint smell of old leather and ink still present. The chair he used every night pushed slightly back, as if he had just stepped away. And the watch box sat open on the desk like an unanswered question, its velvet lining pressed flat by years of habit, because my husband never missed a night winding that watch. Not once in 3 decades. Not when money was thin. Not when work broke his back. Not even when sickness slowed his hands. And as the jeweler described the watch in steady detail, the weight, the scratch near the clasp, the small nick on the edge. From the winter, our pipes froze. I understood my son had known exactly what he was selling, because those marks were not flaws. They were records of survival. And when the jeweler explained my son had asked for immediate payment, had mentioned Paris with a smile, had spoken as if the watch were nothing more than metal, I felt the study close in around me, not with grief, but with clarity, because that watch was never a gift to our son. It was a lesson my husband planned to pass down when the time was right. Now it was sitting behind a glass counter, because my son believed inheritance meant entitlement. And as I thanked the jeweler for calling and agreed to come in person, my eyes returned to the empty desk. In that absence, I realized this was not the moment my family betrayed my husband's memory. It was the moment my husband's preparation quietly began to speak. I did not confront my son. I did not call his wife. I locked the study door and drove to the jeweler alone. The city moving around me as if nothing had shifted. Traffic lights changing on schedule. Storefronts opening like usual. Because betrayal does not announce itself to the world. It only changes the direction of one person's day. And when I arrived, the jeweler greeted me with a professional nod. Not sympathy, not apology, just recognition, as if he already understood that the watch had finally reached the right hands. And when he placed it on the counter, I did not touch it immediately, because seeing it there, stripped of context, priced, documented, waiting for transfer, felt heavier than any argument I could have had at home. And he explained how my son came in confident, spoke quickly, avoided questions about ownership, produced identification without hesitation, signed where indicated, accepted the money without pause, and left without looking back. And I listened carefully, because every detail mattered now, not for anger, but for understanding the depth of what had been done. And then the jeweler leaned forward and lowered his voice, not out of secrecy, but out of respect, and told me there was something unusual, something that made him call instead of completing the resale, because when he opened the back casing to authenticate the piece, he found a second engraving beneath the one I knew. Not decorative, not sentimental, but instructional, precise, dated just 6 months before my husband passed. And the jeweler said my husband had come in alone, asked about discreet documentation, asked how to ensure a message stayed hidden unless the watch was sold, asked what records would surface if ownership changed hands. And at that moment, I felt the quiet pressure of a truth I had not prepared for, because my husband had never been impulsive, never careless, never unaware of his surroundings. As the jeweler slid a copy of the authentication notes across the counter, I understood that the sale was not just an act of greed. It was a trigger, one my husband had calculated in advance. And when I finally picked up the watch, felt its familiar weight settle into my palm, I realized my son did not just sell a family heirloom. He activated a sequence meant for someone who believed they could take without consequence. As I walked back to my car, with the papers folded neatly in my bag, I knew I was no longer deciding whether to confront my family. But when I drove home without turning on the radio, the watch resting in my bag like a witness that had waited years to speak. And when I entered the house, I moved through it quietly, because some truths respond better to silence than confrontation. And I returned to the study, opened the drawer my husband kept locked even from me. The one he said held nothing important, and for the first time since his passing, I understood that statement had been precise, not honest, because importance depends on timing. Inside, I found a slim folder, unmarked, its edges worn as if it had been handled often, but never discussed. And as I sat at his desk, the chair creaking under my weight the same way it did under his, I opened it slowly and found copies of documents my son never knew existed: asset schedules, contingency clauses, trust amendments dated carefully after our last family argument, and a single handwritten note in my husband's steady script instructing the reader to wait until the watch left the family, because he believed that the person who sold it would reveal more with that action than with any words spoken at a dinner table. And as I read line after line, I saw how my husband had divided love from access, how he planned generosity without surrender, how he anticipated entitlement long before I allowed myself to consider it. And the realization settled in with a weight that was not grief, but respect, because he had prepared not for death, but for misuse. And while I was still absorbing the precision of his planning, the front door opened. Voices entered the house, light laughter, travel bags dragged across the floor, and I heard my son speaking about flights and schedules, as if the house were still his to move through freely. And I did not step out. I did not interrupt, because I wanted him to remain comfortable, unaware that something had shifted beneath his feet. And as I closed the folder, placed the watch back into its case, and locked the drawer again, I understood that the real consequence of selling that watch was not financial, not emotional, but procedural. And as my son's voice grew closer down the hall, I remained seated, calm, prepared, knowing that the moment he chose to take what was not his had already placed him exactly where my husband intended him to stand. I did not greet them. I did not raise my voice. I stayed in the study and listened, because distance reveals more than confrontation. And from behind the closed door, I heard my son speak freely, casually, describing Paris as efficient, expensive, worth the cost. And I heard his wife laugh in approval, the sound light, unburdened, as if nothing had been taken to fund it. And that laugh told me more than any confession could have, because it carried certainty, the kind that comes from believing consequences belong to other people. And while they unpacked in the hallway, I reviewed the documents again, slower this time, noticing how each clause was designed to activate only after a specific action, not death, not illness, but transfer. Because my husband understood that the true test of character appears when supervision is gone. And as I followed the language carefully, I saw that the watch was listed not as an object of sentiment, but as a trigger asset tied to conditional review of family privileges, access rights, and decision authority within the company trust. The moment it left direct lineage, oversight shifted, votes recalculated, permissions narrowed, and I realized my son had unknowingly changed his position, not just in the family, but in every structure my husband built. When I finally stepped into the hallway, My son stopped speaking mid-sentence, not out of guilt, but surprise, because he did not expect me to be calm. And calm unsettles people who rely on emotional reactions to regain control. I asked him one question, delivered evenly, without accusation, asking where the watch was, and he answered quickly, rehearsed. Explaining it was unnecessary, better converted into experience, and his wife nodded beside him, confident, supportive, aligned. And I thanked him for his honesty, not because it deserved praise, but because it confirmed every contingency my husband prepared for. And as I turned back toward the study, without further comment, I felt their attention follow me, uncertain now, because silence after confirmation creates more fear than argument. And behind me, I heard my son whisper my name, softer than before, as if sensing for the first time that something irreversible had already been set in motion. I closed the study door again, not to shut them out, but to give events the space to unfold properly, because rushed truth loses its impact. And I sat at the desk where my husband once balanced payroll when we had more bills than income, remembering how he taught me that control is not loud, it is patient. And as I powered on the old laptop he kept disconnected from the house network, I followed the steps he had written years ago in his precise hand, logging into accounts my son never knew existed, accounts that did not move money quickly, but tracked behavior slowly. And as screens loaded and confirmations appeared, I saw how the trust had already flagged the watch's transfer, how automated notices had been sent to legal counsel, compliance officers, and the board secretary, not as accusations, but as neutral updates, the kind that trigger reviews without emotion. And while my son and his wife spoke in the living room about jet lag and schedules, emails were quietly reshaping their access, freezing discretionary limits, reassigning signature authority, and marking future requests for secondary approval. And the elegance of it struck me, because my husband never believed in punishment, only recalibration. And as I reviewed the timeline, I realized the watch was never meant to stay in the family forever. It was meant to leave under the wrong conditions, so the system could identify who believed love was ownership. And when my phone vibrated with the first message from the company's legal office confirming receipt of the trigger notice, I did not reply immediately, because timing mattered, and I wanted my son to experience the natural delay between action and consequence, the same delay he assumed would protect him. And as I shut down the laptop and placed it back exactly where it belonged, I heard my son knock lightly on the study door, his voice measured now, asking if we could talk later. And I agreed without opening it, because later was already in motion. And as his footsteps retreated, I looked once more at the watch, resting quietly in its case, understanding that the smallest object in this house had just begun the largest conversation my family had ever avoided. The next morning, I watched my son move through the house as if nothing had changed, coffee in hand, casual laughter, the scent of fresh croissants filling the kitchen. But I saw every detail, every micro-expression that betrayed confidence built on ignorance. And I stayed in the study, listening, because observation often reveals more than confrontation. As he spoke on the phone about travel arrangements, I accessed the second layer of my husband's preparation, series of encrypted emails and digital instructions that outlined exactly how to respond to misuse of key family assets, each step carefully timed, each action predetermined. And I realized my husband had foreseen this moment, not in imagination, but in meticulous documentation, knowing that our son's sense of entitlement would lead him to overreach. And while my son mentioned Paris, hotel suites, and experiences he believed were earned, the system quietly shifted around him. Accounts flagged, voting rights reduced, discretionary privileges temporarily suspended, all without a single human intervention. The power of planning, exceeding the impulsive actions of a child who thought he controlled everything. And as I walked quietly past the living room, pretending to attend to morning chores, I noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flickered when he mentioned the watch, small, almost imperceptible, but present. And I felt the satisfaction not of revenge, but of inevitable consequence, because my husband never intended to confront, only to reveal. In this quiet, measured unfolding, I understood that the lesson was already working, recalibrating entitlement, reinforcing respect for legacy. And as I returned to the study, the watch case in my hands, I reviewed the engravings again, one hidden, one obvious, both speaking volumes about values, foresight, and responsibility. And when my son finally walked past, heading toward the study to ask what I had planned for the day, he hesitated at the threshold, sensing a change, a presence he could not measure. And I closed the door softly behind him, leaving him uncertain, because uncertainty is the most precise form of control. And as I placed the watch back into its box, the weight of it felt like a promise that some lessons are learned only when the smallest acts are observed, recorded, and finally confronted in their own time. By midday, the house had settled into a quiet rhythm, one that I controlled without effort, because after decades of careful observation, I knew how to let appearances lull people into false confidence. And I remained in the study, watch resting before me, as I reviewed the intricate layers my husband had left behind, the hidden clauses in the trust, the secret accounts, the email triggers, each one designed not to punish, but to expose character under pressure. And I understood now why he had insisted on engravings, why he had planned for the precise day the watch might leave, because small actions reveal true intentions. And as I sipped my tea, my son wandered into the study under the pretense of casual curiosity, asking about mundane things, bills, schedules, the company's minor decisions, unaware that every word, every step he took was logged, timed, considered in the unfolding pattern my husband had created. And I let him speak, nodding minimally, because silence carries more weight than argument. And as he mentioned their Paris plans again, I felt the quiet satisfaction of inevitability, because what they saw as freedom was now bounded by invisible barriers, approvals delayed, privileges checked, all actions flowing into a system he could not see. While he turned away to fetch another cup, I examined the hidden engraving one last time, noting the precision of the date, the intentional ambiguity of phrasing, the quiet authority of a man who understood that respect and consequence must always coexist. And when my son returned, placing the cup on the edge of the desk, he glanced at the watch and flinched slightly, subtle, almost imperceptible. In that tiny reaction, I saw everything my husband had anticipated, the assumption of entitlement, the surprise of control being exercised without confrontation, the understanding that some inheritance is earned only through vigilance, patience, and recognition of limits. And as I placed the watch back into its case and closed the velvet lid, I knew the day had begun its teaching, slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. And when I left the study to prepare lunch, the atmosphere had shifted, not visibly, but in the micro-expressions, the posture, the careful steps. And in that invisible tension, I understood fully that the watch was never just an object. It was the opening act of a lesson that would continue until acknowledgement and respect replaced entitlement. Late that afternoon, I returned to the study after pretending to busy myself with errands around the house, moving slowly so my son and his wife remained convinced nothing had changed. And as I sat at the desk, I opened the laptop and accessed the family trust's internal logs, which my husband had coded to notify me quietly whenever key assets were moved without proper authorization. And the notifications told a story of ignorance, assumption, and deliberate disregard. because my son believed ownership equaled freedom, and I realized that every digital footprint, every timestamp, every signature he had left when selling the watch now worked against him, automatically recalculating privileges and redefining boundaries. And I traced each step carefully, noting where he had unknowingly triggered reviews, frozen certain accounts, and activated oversight protocols, each designed not for punishment, but to expose who treated family legacy as property rather than responsibility. And while my son and his wife discussed dinner plans in the living room, oblivious to the quiet enforcement of consequences, I felt a steady calm, because patience now became my most effective tool. And when I returned to the hidden folder in the drawer, I discovered a handwritten note I had not seen before, dated 6 weeks prior to my husband's passing, explaining how he had anticipated exactly this kind of recklessness, the phrasing meticulous, precise, almost mechanical, outlining how the first unauthorized transaction would trigger scrutiny. And I understood fully that the watch's sale was never a mistake. It was a test, a catalyst, a mechanism to separate ignorance from awareness. And as I closed the folder and looked at the watch again, I realized my husband's foresight extended beyond our family, because any outsider observing would see only a transaction, while inside the house, control had shifted invisibly, power recalculated quietly, and respect demanded without confrontation. And as my son's footsteps neared the study again, hesitant, careful, I remained seated, calm, the weight of the watch now a symbol not of memory, but of authority. And in that silence, I recognized the magnitude of what had been set in motion. That one small object, sold for pleasure, had begun unraveling entitlement and revealing character in ways no argument, no lecture, and no emotional appeal ever could. Evening fell, and the house dimmed under the fading light, yet the tension inside felt heavier than any shadow, because the consequences my husband had designed do not wait for sunlight. They move quietly, steadily, invisibly. And I remained at the desk, the watch lying before me, its weight familiar yet transformed, a relic turned instrument of truth. And as my son and his wife moved through the kitchen, talking about flights, souvenirs, and schedules, I monitored every gesture, every micro-expression, noticing how casual postures shifted when I entered the room, how laughter faltered ever so slightly when I passed. And I returned to the folder in the drawer, reviewing every clause, every trigger, every contingency my husband had meticulously prepared, understanding fully that each layer was interconnected, a web designed to reveal character, enforce boundaries, and recalibrate entitlement. And while they believed the day was ordinary, the system my husband left was active, accounts frozen for discretionary spending, signatures rerouted, access permissions temporarily revoked, and each adjustment executed automatically without my intervention, but visible enough to those who thought control was theirs to take. And I studied the hidden engraving again, tracing the letters with a fingertip, feeling the deliberate intention behind every mark, every nuance, every word carefully placed to communicate beyond sentiment, to instruct, to protect. And as I set the watch back in its case, I realized my son had underestimated the depth of foresight, the quiet power of preparation, the way a simple act could ripple through layers of consequence. And when my son appeared at the study door later, casual on the surface, but cautious in stance, asking what I had been doing all day, I remained seated, calm, letting the silence stretch, because the most precise lessons are delivered without words. And in that pause, I saw the first hint of realization flicker in his eyes, the small crack in confidence that comes when someone finally senses the magnitude of what they've triggered. And as I returned my attention to the watch, now resting quietly, I knew the day had already begun dismantling assumptions, recalculating privileges, setting in motion the reckoning my husband had predicted long before the first misstep occurred. Night approached, and the house grew quiet. But I did not rest. The day had unfolded exactly as my husband predicted, and the consequences of my son's actions were already settling into place, subtle but irreversible. And I remained in the study, the watch before me, its presence heavier now, almost accusatory, because it was no longer merely a family heirloom. It was a measure of character, an instrument of truth. And as I opened the hidden folder again, tracing the precise language of my husband's contingencies, I understood fully how each step of my son's impulsive decision had activated a chain he could not control. Digital flags sent to legal counsel, automatic reviews triggered, access rights recalculated, privileges suspended without confrontation, all executed quietly, invisibly, yet fully effective. And I noticed the change even in my son's tone when he spoke from the living room about their trip. Casual phrases, now laced with hesitation, laughter slightly forced, as if the first sense of consequence had begun to creep into his awareness. And while his wife discussed flights and accommodations, I followed the subtle shift in body language, the way confidence faltered, the way a person begins to recognize they are no longer in command. And I sipped my tea slowly, feeling the calm authority that comes when preparation meets recklessness. And as I returned to the engravings on the watch, hidden and obvious, I traced each line, each mark, each deliberate choice my husband made to communicate, to instruct, to protect without confrontation. And I realized that the watch had never been about memory or sentiment alone. It was about vigilance, foresight, and the slow revelation of truth. And as my son eventually appeared at the study doorway, hesitant, careful, trying to sound casual while measuring my reaction, I let him stand there, silent, because silence now carried more weight than any lecture, any raised voice, any demand. And in that measured pause, I recognized the first tremor of understanding, the initial recognition that some actions have consequences far beyond the immediate. And as I finally placed the watch back into its velvet case, closing it with deliberate care, I knew that the night had begun its work. The quiet recalibration of privilege, the exposure of entitlement, and the subtle enforcement of respect. And in that calm, controlled observation, I understood that the smallest object in our home had already begun to teach the largest lesson my family would ever receive the next morning. The air felt heavier, not with sound, but with anticipation, because actions set in motion rarely pause for reflection until consequences make themselves visible. And I stayed in the study, the watch resting quietly in its case, a silent reminder of my husband's foresight. While outside the house, life moved on, unaware of the invisible forces now governing our family. And I reviewed the hidden instructions once more, following the logic, the timing, the triggers, each designed to reveal not just greed, but character. And I understood that the first sale had already begun a recalibration. My son could not stop. Recalculations of authority, temporary suspensions, notifications quietly routing to the right channels, all programmed to respond without my intervention, yet signaling unmistakably to those who assumed control was theirs by default. And as my son wandered through the living room, speaking lightly about Paris, I observed every hesitation, every slight flicker of uncertainty in his tone, how confidence wavered when he thought no one was watching. And I let him continue, because the more he believed normalcy remained, the more effective the lesson would be. And I returned to the engravings on the watch, reading them as if they were instructions for a game only my husband and I fully understood, realizing that the combination of hidden message and automatic consequences was more powerful than confrontation, more precise than anger, more instructive than words ever could be. While my son's wife laughed softly about packing schedules, I noticed how her posture subtly shifted when she glanced toward the study, the first hint that she too might sense the change in authority. And I traced the hidden engraving again, feeling the deliberate precision, the care with which my husband ensured that only the right person at the right time would perceive the full message. And as I closed the watch case and placed it back on the desk, I realized that the house itself had become a classroom, the quiet observation a teacher, the smallest of actions. The sale of a single watch was now the opening chapter in a reckoning that would slowly, methodically, expose every assumption my family had made about entitlement, trust, and respect. When my son eventually paused at the doorway, searching for some clue in my calm posture, I allowed the silence to stretch, because the most effective lessons are never announced. They are lived, measured, and felt in the space between action and consequence. And in that silence, I knew that the work had only just begun. By late afternoon, the subtle tension in the house had thickened, unspoken, but unmistakable, because invisible forces now governed the smallest decisions. And I remained in the study, the watch in its case before me, its presence heavier than ever, not for its value, but for the authority it represented. And I traced the engravings again, hidden and obvious, understanding fully how my husband had designed them to communicate lessons beyond sentiment. And while my son moved casually through the kitchen, checking schedules, making light comments about their Paris itinerary, I observed every twitch of muscle, every flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, noting how entitlement begins to crack when oversight is applied subtly, deliberately, invisibly. I reviewed the digital logs from the trust, noticing how automatic recalculations had frozen discretionary spending, rerouted signature approvals, and limited decision-making in ways my son had assumed were untouchable. And I realized the elegance of my husband's foresight. No confrontation, no anger, just precise mechanisms revealing truth, enforcing consequence, and reshaping behavior. And as I poured myself tea and returned to the folder of hidden instructions, I saw the dates, the precise sequences, the contingency planning that accounted for impulsive decisions. And I understood that the sale of the watch was not merely a misstep. It was a trigger my husband had anticipated, a signal that entitlement would meet structured consequence. And while my son laughed from the hallway, oblivious to the invisible recalibration, I felt the quiet authority settle over the house, a reminder that legacy is not only possession, but vigilance, patience, and attention to detail. And as I closed the folder and placed the watch back in its case, I heard my son pause at the study door again, hesitant, searching for reassurance in my calm presence, unaware that he was already experiencing the consequences of choices made carelessly. And in that moment, I knew that what had begun as a simple sale had transformed into a slow, deliberate exposure of character, measured lesson in respect and responsibility that no words could convey. And as the last light of day slipped through the curtains, casting long shadows across the desk, I understood that the house itself had become a silent witness to reckoning, that the quiet, methodical unfolding of my husband's plan had only just begun to reshape the family he had left behind. As night deepened, the house carried a weight that no conversation could lift, because the consequences my husband had orchestrated were now quietly unfolding. And I remained in the study, the watch resting in its case like a sentinel, its presence commanding more than respect. It demanded reflection, awareness, and accountability. And as I revisited the hidden engraving, I traced each letter with deliberate care, understanding the precision behind every choice, every date, every instruction my husband left. And while my son moved through the living room, speaking lightly about Paris, hotels, and excursions, I observed the subtle shifts, the slight hesitation in his tone, the micro flickers of awareness in his posture, the faint tightening of his jaw, all unspoken admissions that control was no longer his alone. And I returned to the digital logs, noting how each automatic recalculation had frozen discretionary accounts, rerouted signature approvals, and activated oversight protocols that operated invisibly, yet effectively, recalibrating authority without a single word spoken. And I realized the brilliance of my husband's foresight, the way he had anticipated entitlement and mapped it precisely to consequences, allowing the system itself to teach the lesson while maintaining calm, order, and subtlety. And I considered how my son's confidence had always been built on assumptions now quietly dismantled, measured, and exposed by mechanisms he could neither see nor understand. And as I closed the folder of instructions, I felt a calm authority settle over the house, a reminder that vigilance, patience, and observation are far more effective than anger or confrontation. And when my son eventually approached the study doorway, his voice careful, tentative, I allowed him to speak, responding minimally, calmly, because silence carries more weight than explanation when consequences are already in motion. And I watched him retreat later, shoulders tense, eyes uncertain, as if sensing for the first time that actions have ripples far beyond immediate perception. And in that silence, I understood fully that the sale of a single watch had become a catalyst, quiet but unyielding instrument of truth and accountability. And as I placed the watch back into its velvet case and locked the drawer, I recognized that the night had just begun to enforce the lesson, recalibrating privileges, exposing character, and revealing the depth of foresight my husband had left behind, a reckoning that would unfold quietly, inevitably, and entirely on its own timeline by early morning. The house felt heavier than ever, though nothing had changed outwardly, because consequence does not announce itself with noise. It arrives in subtle shifts, in hesitation, in the quiet realignment of power. And I remained in the study, the watch before me, its weight familiar, yet transformed into authority. And I reviewed the hidden instructions again, the meticulous notes my husband left detailing how every action outside his control would trigger recalibration. And I traced the engravings once more, hidden and obvious, seeing the layers of foresight, the deliberate precision designed to expose character, enforce boundaries, and preserve respect. While my son moved through the hallway, speaking about their Paris plans, oblivious to the quiet adjustments, discretionary accounts frozen, signature approvals rerouted, privileges limited, all executed automatically and invisibly. And I observed how entitlement begins to crack under subtle oversight, the small micro-expressions that betray confidence, the tiny hesitations, the faltering laughter, all indicators of a system at work, teaching lessons without confrontation, without anger, without discussion. And I realized fully that my husband had engineered not punishment, but inevitability, that the sale of the watch was never a mistake, but a trigger, activating mechanisms to reveal truth, demand accountability, and recalibrate the family dynamic. And as I sipped tea slowly, each sip measured, each thought precise, I noted the tension in my son's posture when he glanced toward the study, a subtle acknowledgement that something had shifted without him knowing how. And I returned to the folder, reading each line again, each contingency, each date, appreciating the quiet genius of a man who planned not for immediate satisfaction, but for methodical enforcement of principles. And when my son eventually paused outside the study door, his voice soft, careful, I allowed silence to stretch between us, because the most effective lessons are felt, not explained. And in that tension, I saw the first cracks in his assumption of control, the slow dawning awareness that some actions carry consequences far beyond intention. And as I placed the watch back into its case and locked the drawer, I understood fully that this quiet, precise orchestration had begun reshaping entitlement, exposing character, and reinforcing respect in ways words never could, and that the reckoning had only just started by late morning. The tension in the house was palpable, though unspoken, because because consequences unfold quietly before they are acknowledged. And I remained in the study, the watch resting in its case, a silent sentinel of authority. And as I traced the engravings again, hidden and obvious, I considered the precision behind every decision my husband had made, every contingency he had planned for, every mechanism designed to reveal truth and enforce accountability. While outside, my son moved through the living room, speaking about flights, hotels, and souvenirs, oblivious to the subtle recalibration occurring automatically. Discretionary accounts frozen, signatures rerouted, access privileges temporarily restricted, and microalerts triggered to compliance officers and legal counsel, all working quietly to expose character without confrontation. I observed every flicker of hesitation in his tone, every shift in posture, every faltering laugh, the smallest details betraying the cracks in his assumed control. And I realized the brilliance of my husband's foresight, that this single sale, impulsive and thoughtless, had activated a chain of events designed to reveal entitlement and enforce respect without anger or argument. And as I sipped tea, the weight of the watch in my hand grounded me, reminding me that power is quiet, deliberate, and measured. And when I returned to the folder of hidden instructions, I saw the sequence of dates, the precise timing of triggers, the contingencies calculated years before, anticipating reckless actions and ensuring that oversight remained invisible yet absolute. And I recognized that this was more than enforcement. It was revelation, a methodical exposure of behavior that relied on observation, patience, subtle influence. And as my son appeared at the study door, hesitant, careful, searching for a clue in my calm presence, I let the silence stretch, because silence now carried the authority my husband had designed. And in that measured pause, I saw the first glimmer of understanding, the initial realization that actions have consequences far beyond the immediate. And as I placed the watch back into its case, locking it with deliberate care, I understood fully that the lesson had begun, quiet, precise, inevitable, and the slow dismantling of entitlement and exposure of character had only just started in earnest. By afternoon, the subtle shifts in the house had grown sharper, more tangible, though still invisible to anyone who did not watch closely. And I remained in the study, the watch in its case before me, a small object that had already begun rewriting authority. And I revisited the hidden instructions, reading line by line, tracing each date, each contingency, each calculation my husband had made to ensure that misused inheritance would reveal true character. While my son moved casually through the rooms, speaking lightly about Paris, unaware that every action, every word, every decision he believed trivial had activated automatic recalibrations, counts frozen, privileges rerouted, oversight triggered, authority subtly shifted, all quietly executed without confrontation, without emotion. And I observed his micro-expressions, the tiny twitch in his mouth, brief hesitation in his step, the fleeting glance toward the study, small signals betraying awareness he could not articulate. And I understood fully that my husband had planned this not as punishment, but as revelation, that the watch was a tool to expose recklessness, entitlement, and character in a controlled, measured way. And as I traced the engravings again, hidden beneath the obvious, I felt the precision of foresight, the deliberate timing, the quiet enforcement of consequence without intervention. And I realized how power operates subtly, invisibly, patiently, waiting for action to reveal truth. And as my son eventually appeared at the study door, trying to mask caution with casual posture, I let silence dominate, because the absence of reaction often carries more authority than words. And I noticed the first flicker of doubt in his eyes, a recognition that he had overstepped, that the world he believed he controlled was no longer fully his. And as I placed the watch back into its velvet case, locking the drawer with deliberate care, I felt the weight not of an object, but of a system in motion, a slow, unstoppable mechanism of recalibration, revelation, and enforcement. And in that quiet, I understood that the sale of one watch had begun dismantling assumptions, exposing character, teaching lessons that would unfold far beyond a single day. Quietly, inevitably, and inescapably by evening, the house had grown quieter, but the weight of consequence hung heavily in every room, subtle, unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. And I remained in the study, the watch resting before me, a small object now carrying the authority of years of preparation. And I opened the folder again, reading every contingency, every hidden instruction my husband had left to govern the family's actions when entitlement eclipsed respect, tracing the engravings on the watch with deliberate attention, understanding the precision behind each mark, each word, each date. While outside, my son moved through the kitchen, his laughter slightly forced, his tone carefully controlled, speaking about their Paris trip as if nothing had shifted, oblivious to the automated recalibrations quietly working against him. Discretionary accounts frozen, approvals rerouted, privileges temporarily limited, oversight activated, all without my intervention, all visible only to those paying attention. And I watched him closely, noting the micro-expressions, momentary hesitation, the almost imperceptible glance toward the study, all tiny cracks forming in the armor of assumed control. And I realized fully that my husband had orchestrated this not to punish, but to reveal that the sale of the watch was a trigger, activating mechanisms designed to expose recklessness, entitlement, and character in precise, deliberate ways. And as I sipped tea, the weight of the watch grounding me, I understood how control operates silently, invisibly, and how patience magnifies its effect. And when my son paused at the study doorway later, his voice measured, careful, I allowed silence to stretch because words were unnecessary when consequences had already begun to speak. And in that pause, I saw the first genuine crack of awareness, the realization that actions have ripple effects far beyond immediate perception. And as I closed the velvet case and locked the drawer with deliberate care, I understood fully that the lesson had moved from theory to practice, that the quiet recalibration of privilege and authority was underway, that the sale of one small watch had become the instrument of a reckoning my family would feel slowly, inevitably, and irrevocably in every action and every assumption they had ever made about entitlement, trust, and respect. Late at night, house felt heavier, though outwardly still, because consequence does not announce itself. It moves quietly, invisibly, reshaping perception and control. And I remained in the study, the watch resting before me, its weight no longer sentimental, but authoritative. And I revisited the hidden instructions once more, tracing each engraving, each line, each contingency my husband had painstakingly left, knowing that the sale of this watch had already activated a sequence of invisible recalibrations. And as I reviewed the digital logs, I saw how discretionary accounts had been frozen, signature approvals rerouted, access privileges adjusted, all quietly, automatically. And the subtle power of these mechanisms began showing effects. My son's tone, when he spoke about Paris, faltered slightly, his laughter less confident, his posture unconsciously cautious, tiny cracks forming in the armor of entitlement. And I realized the brilliance of my husband's foresight, that this was never about punishment, never about confrontation, but about revealing character through controlled consequence. And I observed my son moving through the hallway, pretending ease, but micro-expressions betraying awareness he did not yet understand. And I noted every hesitation, every small glance toward the study, the weight of inevitability settling on him, while his wife remained equally unaware of the invisible recalibration around them. and I sipped my tea slowly, feeling the quiet authority in my hands, understanding that patience magnifies power more than any lecture. When my son eventually appeared at the study door, his voice careful, measured, I allowed the silence to stretch, because the most precise lessons are not spoken, are felt, lived, recognized in the gaps between expectation and reality. And as I placed the watch back into its velvet case and locked the drawer, I understood fully that the smallest act, selling a watch, had triggered a slow, deliberate unraveling of entitlement, a methodical exposure of character, and a recalibration of respect, all unfolding quietly, inevitably, and with a weight far beyond its physical presence. And in that quiet, I realized the reckoning had entered its final stages, reshaping my family's understanding of inheritance, authority, and the cost of careless decisions. The next morning, the house seemed ordinary, but I knew nothing was as it appeared, because consequence does not shout. It seeps quietly into awareness, and I remained in the study, the watch resting in its case, small object now carrying the weight of authority and revelation. And I revisited the hidden instructions, tracing each engraving, reviewing every contingency my husband had meticulously designed to respond to misused inheritance, understanding fully how the sale of this watch had triggered recalibrations that were invisible yet absolute, discretionary accounts frozen, signature approvals rerouted, privileges temporarily restricted, and oversight protocols silently activated, all operating automatically and effectively. And I watched as my son moved through the kitchen, discussing flights and hotels with practiced ease, oblivious to the shifting balance, while micro-expressions betrayed awareness he could not articulate, hesitation in speech, flickers of doubt in posture, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the smallest cracks forming in the armor of entitlement. And I understood completely that my husband's foresight had anticipated not just impulsive actions, but the psychology behind them, designing a system to reveal character without confrontation, without anger, but with precision and inevitability. And as I traced the hidden engraving again, I felt the deliberate authority in each line, each mark, a silent message that truth and consequence are inseparable. When my son appeared at the study doorway, tentative, careful, searching for reassurance in my calm presence, I let silence stretch, because words were unnecessary. The weight of observation and inevitability spoke louder than any lecture could, and I noticed for the first time a real tremor in his confidence, a recognition that control was no longer his alone, that the world he assumed belonged to him had quietly shifted. And as I closed the watch's velvet case and locked the drawer, I felt the final layers of preparation settling into place, knowing that the slow, deliberate reckoning my husband had designed had nearly run its course, exposing entitlement, recalibrating authority, and revealing the depth of foresight, patience, meticulous planning that had been silently guarding our family legacy all along. And I understood that tomorrow would mark the final stage, where lessons would be acknowledged, accountability realized, respect enforced in ways no words could achieve. By the next morning, the house was quiet, but the weight of consequence hung in every corner, palpable to those who could sense control slipping. And I remained in the study, the watch resting in its case, a small object that had transformed into the ultimate measure of authority, truth, and foresight. And I traced the engravings one last time, appreciating the meticulous planning my husband had executed to expose entitlement, enforce accountability, and reveal character without confrontation. While outside, my son and his wife moved through the living room, tempting casual conversation, the surface calm, but micro-expressions betraying understanding they could not yet articulate, the slight faltering of laughter, the hesitation in speech, the subtle tension in shoulders, all markers of the slow, precise recalibration that had been quietly unfolding since the watch left its place, and I reviewed the digital logs one final time, noting how discretionary accounts remained limited, approvals routed through additional channels, and oversight permanently embedded, all automated and irreversible, demonstrating the brilliance of foresight and the inevitability of consequence. And as I sipped tea, I reflected on how my husband had designed not punishment, but revelation, teaching lessons in responsibility, respect, and the recognition of boundaries that my son had assumed were irrelevant. And when he appeared at the study doorway, tentative, careful, searching for acknowledgement or reassurance, I allowed silence to dominate, because the most effective lessons are lived, felt, and recognized, not spoken. And in that quiet, I saw full comprehension finally flicker across his face, recognition that actions have consequences far beyond intent, that entitlement carries a price, and that legacy demands vigilance, respect, and humility. And as I closed the velvet case and locked the drawer with deliberate care, I felt the completion of the reckoning my husband had designed, a measured, unstoppable sequence that had exposed character, recalibrated privilege, and delivered justice without anger, confrontation, or chaos. And I turned toward them calmly, my voice steady, saying simply, "Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to help stories like this be heard." And with a soft, polite nod, I added, "Thank you," knowing fully that the lessons of foresight, consequence, and respect would echo far beyond this day, engraved in memory as indelibly as the watch itself.